The first panel is on lived religion and the history of emotions. In our earlier study days in this sequence of events, we had the feeling that knowing more about the history of emotions would help us focus attention on the qualitative aspects of religion as it made people feel, as well as how it helped them understand their feelings of grief, for example. And we also thought there might be methodological points of contact between uncovering the history of emotions and researching lived religion. Therefore, we looked to the long-established Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the History of Emotions, which has led the field in emotions research since it was first funded in 2011. And I'm delighted to say that Sue Broomhall and Linda Zampol are able to join us today. Hello. Linda is the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Global Fellow with Ca Foscari University of Venice and the Australian Catholic University. Sue is Director of the Gender and Women's History Research Centre at the Australian Catholic University, and she's writing one book on gender and the Dutch East India Company for Amsterdam University Press, and another on the interaction of Catholic missionaries and Dutch East India Company authorities with Korean women in the 16th and 17th century. In today's session, beginning now, they're going to be speaking to us about living faith in disastrous times and consolation and paths to Catholic evangelization.
Hopefully that means it's over to us.
Yes.
Hopefully you can hear me okay. We have a PowerPoint to share, so I wonder if I can now share my screen, and fingers crossed this will work. Okay, so now if I can just get this sorted. How's that looking? Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for inviting us to speak today. It's a great privilege to be in this company, and I really enjoyed the sessions yesterday that I was able to attend. It got a bit late in the evening for me, so I missed some of the end sections, unfortunately, but here we are today. I wanted to begin by acknowledging that I live and work and am speaking to you today from the lands and seas of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and that Whadjuk Noongar people remain the cultural custodians of this land and continue to practice their beliefs, languages and culture here in this land that is unceded. Right, I think if I just can give you a little bit of an overview of what we thought we would do in this section. We have the pre-circulated papers, and in those we focused very much on the materials themselves that we were working with at the moment. 2,500 words isn't a lot to cover all the things we wanted to, but we sort of put the focus on that, and we thought today what we would do is try to put that in some context, I guess, of overview of different kinds of approaches from the humanities to studying emotions in the past as a starting point, and then to discuss where this research fits with our current research projects or the ones that we're about to begin in the case of Linda, and then talk a little more about the case study material that we had. And so hopefully that will make some sense of where we're heading in this. Linda and I are going to tag team through this PowerPoint, and hopefully this will all work seamlessly, but we shall see. So I don't know if you're seeing this the way I am. I've got some buttons that are actually over the top of the titles. Hopefully it's clearer from your point of view. But essentially what we thought we would do is start with a little bit of a discussion about where the field has come from. I mean, as you just introduced it then, Tessa, it's clear that some people in this group have already been looking at emotions, thinking about emotions. But often when we speak on this subject, we are really struck by people who are still saying, how do we talk about emotions? Do they have a history? Is that possible? So I hope you don't mind that I've taken, I guess, a fairly large step back, certainly for me, to about 10 years ago, to think about some of the questions that we came to the Centre of the History of Emotions with about emotions and what could be done with them in a kind of historical, or at least emotions in the past. I wouldn't say necessarily in a historical methodologies. Actually, it's very much multidisciplinary from the point of view of our centre. But I guess here are some starting points for the way we've been thinking about emotions in this way. And very basically, there's a starting point that assumes that it is possible to talk about emotions having a history. And by that, I mean, that's a sort of shorthand, of course, but what we're thinking about there is perhaps research that originally emerged from social psychology. That's certainly a starting point for some of the thinking here, that emotions operate differently. They're embedded in particular cultures, subcultures, particular contexts, they're relational, and therefore if we can think about that as social psychologists do usually in the present, then it should also operate in past cultures. If we understand that cultures in the past don't operate exactly the same way as now, which is a basic assumption of history and its practice, that the elements have changed over time, although there may be some continuities, then what would that mean if we think about emotions as a topic of focus of much of our research? So there's a very basic starting point that it is possible to think about emotions as having some kinds of change in that experience, in the description, in the way we think about that kind of human behavior, if you like. A second point might be to think about that emotions themselves make history. And so here there's a set of questions about how do emotions affect what it is that we do as humans? If we understand them as a critical part of human behavior, how come they haven't really featured often in the ways we've understood the past? How do they shape events? And those events can be very large. We might think of collective and communal experiences and sort of large scale things like the French Revolution level, but we can also think about very small, intimate, individual actions and experiences that also have great ramifications within an individual person's life or in a community or a family situation. So the scale can vary very, very widely, but the idea here is to think through the idea that emotions have, if we think they have some impact and some importance, then how does that shape actually how we think about what is going on historically? Now, underpinning all of that, which might have already have come to your mind, is, well, what is this thing that we are calling an emotion? And in fact, that's one of the most vexed questions in this whole area, because I think what is very clear is that we do not share an understanding across lots of different disciplines, whether we're talking in the present or the past, but for the most part, I'm talking about disciplines interested in the past, and particularly in the medieval and early modern past is the area I've worked on. We do not share an understanding that we're talking about the same thing, and that can make it very difficult. And I mean that in a couple of senses. One is emotions, as I'm using it here, is effectively a sort of shorthand for a whole lot of things that range from passion and affect and feeling, mood, feeling cultures, sometimes sin as it's understood in the past. The ideas of the things that we're encapsulating under this kind of set of experiences of human behavior can be very broad. A mood is very different to a very intense particular feeling moment, or what we might think of as an emotion. So that already is one way in which the scale of these things can be very different. The words that we're using around them can be different, but actually also the experience that we are seeking to capture as analysts of some kind of scholars can actually itself be very different as we want to understand it and investigate it, but also as the people we're talking about and reading those works of in the past are thinking about it. So there's a difference between how we might want to look at it as scholars and how the past is writing about it, but there's also very wide differences in how scholars themselves are interested in this. So that's a really tricky problem, and it is through a lot of the research that you'll see in the field. But I guess one of the starting points would be for people as they work on this topic to define what it means for them, because in defining what it means for you, it changes perhaps what we might look for, the kinds of methodologies that are appropriate, the sort of sources one would read. So understanding what it is we want to know and defining what that emotional experience, if I can use that very broadly, bearing in mind the discussion, yes, about experience, and it of course has a set of qualities that we have to investigate as well. These things all have to be unpacked. So at least the starting point is to define what we mean in any given moment so that we have a kind of groundwork for understanding what can be shared across different disciplines, studies, and so forth. Okay, now if I come quickly to the history of emotion. So this is the centre that Tessa was referring to. So this is in the Australian system, centres of excellence are the largest scale of funding that can be offered to any kind of academic group, whether they're in the sciences, the humanities, or anywhere else. So this is a very large scale kind of project. And the reason I mention that is because I think by comparison to some of the other groups that we're dealing with who are also called centres, I have a feeling that the way in which the Centre of History of Emotions operated was extremely broad. It was not shaped around a one single research question. I think what brings us together is that we were interested in humanities. We are interested in, the centre continues, in humanities approaches to historical emotional experience. So it's a very broad kind of program. It's certainly a set of programs, in fact, that were operating at once. We had, it was the largest funding ever given to the humanities in Australia. At some point in time, we had about 130 different researchers working for us, and certainly over the length of now, what is a 10-year period, we have had lots of people pass through the centre and interrogate their aspects of this in very many different ways. So one of the things I think, if you were to go onto the website and you look at the research that's being produced out of this centre, is that it's very, very diverse. And that diversity is really at the heart of what we did, because the central researchers who began this project, and it's evolved over time, the current director, the current directorial team, I'm very proud to say, are actually previous postdoctoral fellows within the centre. And it's really nice to see that generational change happen. So sometimes I'm talking a bit in the past because I came from the origins of this, and now we've kind of passed the mantle to new people, and that's fantastic. But there's a very big group of people involved, and we come from many different disciplines. So there were musicologists, there were literary scholars, there were art scholars, there were visual scholars, there were material scholars, there were people working in drama and performance, there were practitioners in all sorts of dramatic and musical senses particularly, as well as historians and those working in heritage contexts as well. So it's and tourism. So it's a very big group of people who were operating and interested in emotions in many different ways that were relevant to their particular field and discussion. So we were oriented under a number of programs, and these carried from about 2011 to 2018. The first 7 years of the program, and now they've evolved and moved into different ways in which the work of the centre is carried out. But just to give you a bit of an overview to how these were operating, these were structuring principles about people fell under different categories. Not all their work had to fit into one of these programs. People moved across them as they asked different kinds of questions. But effectively, one of our key early programs was about meanings, about what it is that people in the past thought emotions were, how they understood them, how they expressed them, what words they were using, what they thought they meant, how they were enacted in this broad period of the medieval and early modern that you see there. And so that was very important, critical work to just get a grasp on exactly the kinds of language and vocabularies that were at stake in the work that we were doing. The change program took a particular interest, perhaps a more historical interest, and looked very much at mass and communal emotions that were seen to be driving political change, social change, and how those were operating. Religion had a very strong role in this particular program. They were seen as fundamentally important to how, not only because religious fields are often oriented around the affect and emotions, but also because organized religion had a very large role in the management of emotions in society. So there were quite a lot of studies in here that were related to religion. And as you see at the, well, I know I don't expect you to have read that all very quickly, but there were a lot of discussion in this program about religious rituals and practices, processions, witchcraft, pilgrimages were a very important part of the work done, particularly by the postdoctoral fellows in that program. Then we moved to performance. This program worked not only through practitioners and scholars of performance, theatre, drama, music, but also worked with companies. So we worked with opera companies, we worked with National Gallery in Victoria, so art galleries, and a whole lot of different sort of spaces. So these were both scholarly programs and applied programs, and those things intersected very closely. So here we're thinking very much about how emotions are thought, felt, performed as they are delivered through dramatic performance, musical performance, and in the visual arts. And then finally, a fourth program, perhaps the one I was most associated with, is the Shaping the Modern program. This is really key to the nature of the Centres of Excellence in Australia, where there's a very strong orientation about why does this research matter to the present. And 1/4 of our complete program was dedicated to thinking about why does this period's emotions matter? What does it say about Australia today? How do these things linger in our society? How have they shaped the society we're in? And this program had a good deal to do with heritage and tourism and curation of understanding of emotions in contemporary culture in Australia. Very active program in that space. So this is a bit of a summary of the overview. In terms of my own research in this program, I'm trained as, I guess, a cultural historian probably is where I'm coming from, but also as a literary scholar. And so both of those elements are at play in the work that I do in different places. across the centre's work. And you perhaps see the echoes of that in this particular work that I presented, because I'm very interested, I think, in texts and genres and the kind of work that is done in performing emotions in a textual kind of space, and what is that doing as a form of performance is of interest to me. Okay, one more slide from me, and then Linda will be able to speak. And you'll have a bit of a break from me. But just if we now orient towards current projects. So I'm currently working at ACU, Australian Catholic Uni, and just in the last year, we've developed a 5-year program. It's led by the Medieval and Early Modern Studies program, which I'm affiliated with, but Megan Cassidy-Walsh is currently leading that program. And this is a specific program on religious mobilities. So coming out, I guess, initially of Christian practice and Christianities in the plural, but thinking about how that intersects with the wider medieval and early modern world. And so thinking about the role that religion has in relation to mobility, whether that's in texts, in material objects, in people, of course, but also in practices and rituals and so forth. And I guess the part of that program that I connect with, and Linda's work will connect with when she joins us, will be to think through what happens when Europeans are practicing their religions abroad, often in situations, as in the examples here in these papers, situations that challenge them, either because they're culturally very different. In my case, it's a bit more of a disaster situation or a new kind of experience that was unexpected. My work in that program will take into account 2 different areas. One will be the Catholic missions, partly the missions, but also the conversions, and so an interest in individuals in East Asia. My work there will be to do with Japan, to some extent Korea, as it's contacted through Japan and through China, also in China, to some extent the Philippines. So definitely a kind of Asian focus to that. And I'll continue some of the work that I'm currently doing on the Dutch East India Company and thinking more about the religious aspects of that company within that program of research. So that's a 5-year program of research. It entails a number of different researchers within the medieval and early modern program at ACU and connected to a wider international field. There'll be activities in both Australia and in Europe. ACU has a Rome campus, so we'll be running activities across Europe and Australia there that we hope to see many of you involved in. So that's really where some of this work is coming from for me, as well as Tessa explained at the beginning, through some current writing I'm doing on the Dutch East India Company. I'll speak to that a little more in a minute, but I will throw now to Linda to speak about where the research that she's talking about here connects in.
Yes, thank you very much, Sue. And I also wanted to thank the organizers of this conference for having me today. So I have to say I am quite new to the history of emotions studies because I officially started 2 weeks ago with my Marie Skłodowska-Curie action with the Australian Catholic University and with Ca Foscari, the University of Venice. So I just wanted to give a very brief overview of what my current project is about. So it's titled Emotions as Practice in the Early Modern Jesuit Missions in the Asia Pacific. And as the title suggests, I am taking an emotion as practice approach to study 6 different missions of the Society of Jesus, that is the Jesuit missionaries, from 1549 to 1722, excuse me. In a bit, I will speak more about what the emotion as practice approach is. But for now, I just wanted to mention my main research questions. And those are going to be, first, what emotional characteristics were attributed to the target peoples? During my research on the texts produced by the Society of Jesus in Asia, I came to realize that one of the first things that the Jesuits did once they reached a new target country, new target people, was to delineate their main characteristics, and together with more culturally related characteristics, they mentioned some emotional aspects that could help them navigate what were the best options for evangelization. So my first research question will look at what kind of image did the Jesuits depict of these people. Then we'll go on to identify the emotional practices that the missionaries used to bridge cultural divides. And that becomes, I think, very important since most of the research that has been done on the missionaries of the Society of Jesus in Asia has to do more with theological approaches, and not so much with an eye towards lived religion. Therefore, I will be looking at practices exactly in this framework of emotion as practice. The third question that I will try to answer is what impact did these characteristics and practices have on the process of othering of Asian people, and if we can track what sort of consequences this process had on later in different stages of history, in the history of the relation between Asia and Europe. As I said, I have just started this project, so for me it's a very new thing, but I hope that by 2024 I will have answers to most of these questions, hopefully all of them. And for now, I can only say this, so I give back the microphone to Sue.
Thanks very much, Linda. Yes, I should emphasize very much that the opportunity for this conference came up at a point where Linda had just been starting to speak to me about her project, and I thought, oh, this would be a good chance for us to sort of begin to work together. But it's very preliminary stages that we're in the development of that work. That's very exciting as it moves forward. Okay, if I can, I will now just jump to the next slide. Now, if we perhaps move to talk a little bit about our case studies. I don't want to reiterate them. The work is there if people want to have a look at a little bit more of the detail of the kind of text, quotes, and so forth. I wanted to sort of do a little bit of summary, if I can, of where coming from here. Tessa, for me in particular in this case, Tessa mentioned at the beginning, I'm finishing up writing a book on gender and the Dutch East India Company. And so some of my interest here, I think, in formulating this paper was to think through how emotion and lived religion, I suppose, faith, come together to help create a kind of identity for VOC men. So when I say VOC men on the coast, that is quite important to me in terms of both what it is to be a man in this particular group, and what it means to be part of the Dutch East India Company itself. That's quite critical. You'll see through what you would have seen in the examples that a kind of heteronormative assumption about what it is to be a man in this company is really brought to the fore in one of the particular incidents under investigation here, whether or not the incident itself takes place. So I'm interested in how identity is acting as a kind of, how emotion is acting as an identity marker in the way it's being performed. How does that particular way in which emotions are being performed here give some sense of what it is to perform as a man in the company in the right ways, and how can it be done correctly or inappropriately and so forth? But I'm also very much interested, as I mentioned earlier, in texts themselves and what texts are doing to create these understandings and different kinds of text form, whether it's a logbook, a kind of a summary account, administration of the Dutch East India Company that I've explored elsewhere in terms of its kind of communicative rituals and the role of emotional expression in those. That's also very much of interest to me, how different genres that the company is operating in also are part of that set of emotional performances. And then also I'm interested here in how faith practices intersect with emotional experiences as they're perceived by these men in these different kinds of texts that we have, in terms of being problematic, or particularly the emotional content perhaps being problematic, and the role of faith in producing a resolution that seems to be positive for them here. So I'm hoping that you can see my little mouse here on the screen. So I'll just give you a little bit of context here. Here we are. This is Western Australia. Oh, I've lost my mouse. There we are. This is me down here today in Whadjuk Noongar country, down in Perth. Just to give you a sense, the Zerwick accounts are about living on an island for just about 8-9 months. These islands, just so you can see, are here, these little dots here. So they're off the coast of what is now Western Australia. And just to give you a little bit of situation for Lehman, I always say Abraham Lehman, but he's actually from Sandwich in England. So I really should just be calling him Abraham Lehman, but I don't know, he seems to have turned Dutch, and maybe that's relevant, in fact, in terms of how he's positioning himself in the company, because he is actually English born, but he's operating as a Dutch East India Company man in the way he writes his account. Okay, so for him, he starts roundabout where I am right now, and sails the boat with his companions all the way, oh, I keep losing this mouse, all the way from the base here, I hope you can see this, all the way up to Batavia, which is present-day Jakarta, Indonesia, more or less. So it's a pretty long journey that he makes, and it's pretty bleak. And perhaps one of the other contexts that's not mentioned in the paperwork I gave you, but perhaps some of you will know about the other Batavia story, not the town, the headquarters of the VOC in Indonesia, but the Batavia massacre that takes place in 1628, so 1629. So in a period before both of these encounters that we're talking about today, another shipwreck, there are a number of shipwrecks on the West Australian coastline, a number of accidents, close encounters, but in this particular one, we have a similar incident where a ship is wrecked and people come ashore on an island, same islands, in fact, and there's a terrible massacre, and a huge number of people, roughly about 100 people, are killed while they're waiting for assistance from the Batavia up the headquarters. And so a number, I guess, in the background of some of these accounts is an attempt not to have the same situation, that terrible situation, occur again. So particularly when I read the Zerwick account, which is the more recent, it's the 18th century account, I think it's really critical that they're reflecting through, they're actually literally on the same island. Some of the artifacts from that earlier time on the island are there. It's right around them in terms of finding artifacts that remind them of this previous set of events that happened in the very same landscape, and an attempt to avoid that by a different kind of set of practices. That's kind of a critical back history, I guess, to some of perhaps what's happening. Okay, so I wanted to show you just how bleak some of these places were. This is not idyllic places to spend 8-9 months. It's completely bleak kind of environment to be in, and very, very different, of course, to where most of these people have come from, wherever they come from in Europe. Most of the crews are Europeans, if they're not all Dutch, and this kind of landscape is completely unfamiliar. So that's another context, of course, I want to remind that when we think about these accounts, these particular accounts both are ones that happen in extreme kinds of circumstances. There's a whole nother side of the Dutch East India correspondence, the archive, that is not operating in a situation like this, although it's always a threat. It sits in the background of a lot of the documentation, and I think you could argue it frames a lot of the way the company understands itself, how it should protect itself, how it should perform in certain circumstances, because there's always a threat of these kinds of disastrous events. Nonetheless, I think that's rather important in terms of thinking about what emotions are expressed, what aspects of faith are expressed in these accounts. These are also accounts that come after the event. So both of them are, I guess, workshopped for particular audiences. Certainly the logbook was probably in some form produced at the time, but the copies we have now are clean copies. They're very neat. They've obviously been transcribed. So they're copies that are made knowing that the people survived who wrote them, clearly. So I think that probably, I can't tell you how much it changed it because we don't have the before, but I think it's probably important to know that there is the events that were resolved in some sense positively, and then that of course shapes the text. They are, of course, as I'm saying, framed for this particular religious, particular corporate culture of the VOC. if not everybody in the VOC is a Protestant of the Dutch variety of the time. There's certainly a kind of understanding that people are participating in that culture, that they understand some aspects of what drives the VOC. And although it is not like a Catholic mission culture of, say, the Jesuits, it nonetheless has strong religious aspects. In some cases, it has missionary aspects. They talk in a missionary language at certain points in certain contexts when they encounter populations. Really, this is not, there's a kind of common story of like, well, the company just thinks through money. Money is very important, but they certainly do not ignore religious values and even the understanding that God has justified their encounter with the world through trade. So this is pretty critical. And as I've said, I think emotion and faith come together here as really intertwined as aspects of identity for what it means to be a VOC man. Now, so there's a question here of like, oh, why keep separating these two things? And I suppose, you know, I think I said in the text, oh, they're difficult to separate where one ends and the other begins. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, well, why do we need to disentangle them? Why should they be disentangled? And again, that comes back to what is the question we're trying to answer? What are we trying to get to the bottom of? And I guess perhaps for my purposes of thinking about what it is to be a VOC man, perhaps it's not necessary. Anyway, that's to reflect on. Okay, here's another shot of what this landscape looks like. So, okay, I'm saying here that they're intertwined in various ways. And I think what I was trying to articulate in the text is how suddenly when we're in a situation of extreme disaster of some kind, then a perceived disaster itself is of course a cultural experience that we can debate, but these people appear to be perceiving it as some sort of terrible out of the ordinary event. And suddenly we find rhetorically a very explicit discussion of emotion and faith that has not been present in the text in the same way. So I think that's very interesting that that shift in the language that becomes valuable in these situations. As I talk about in that particular text, we can see the way that, particularly in the Zeeuwijk text that's written by Adriaan van der Graaf, so this is the 18th century Zeeuwijk encounter where they're sitting on the islands for about 8-9 months, the importance of prayer. And this is signaled really graphically in the text in that, of course, he talks about prayer and how they prayed, that they would have divine assistance, and then usually it comes good. And so again, this is the kind of retrospective, perhaps I only mention the ones where it comes good, or you kind of frame it in the accumulation of benefits that come from prayer. But what you see in the way the text is lined up is this kind of, there's a side column where sort of key events are mentioned. Earlier in the text, that might have been the death of a crew member or so forth. But when it gets to the island, what is mentioned in the side column is, we did a big prayer. And so suddenly this faith practice comes to the fore as a kind of comment worthy of note in the margin. And I think that in itself is also interesting. And so through that particular account, we see this kind of accumulation of evidence as, well, perhaps it's an emotional resource of the moment that the recording, look, it's helped, and that's important when they're on the island. But also this kind of overview that I see through a lot of the Dutch East India text, particularly in moments of disaster like this, is this kind of reassurance that God really does want them to do this work. God understands the value of the mission that they're attempting to undertake globally, and that they haven't made a mistake in understanding what it is they're meant to be doing. We also see in the second half of the examples that in that particular text, this key event that is sometimes now described as kind of one of the first moments of LGBTQIQ violence in Australia, which is about this claim that 2 young sailors were committing sodomy, as it was understood at the time, and they are cast to 2 separate islands where effectively they probably would have died if they weren't looked after by local people of the area. We don't know what happened to them, but certainly there wasn't an attempt to protect their lives. I think that's pretty clear. Now, what we see there is less, I haven't talked so much about what happens to them, but in terms of how the community tries to regroup and understand itself, again, through the language of faith here, to manage a kind of very difficult emotional and social experience of these men that have been together for a very long time and suddenly having to cast out members and explain that and justify it in the language of the text. And so we see these kind of restorative religious acts that are trying to bring that community, the ones who remain, back together. And they do talk in the language of the text about needing the protection from what they perceive will be divine punishment if they do not eject these members from the community. Okay, just quickly on to the others. Now we move to the Lehman account, which is actually sort of 70 years earlier or so, but I think it made sense to look at it second because there are very similar elements between some of the texts. So what I tried to pick up here was some interesting elements where Abraham Lehman is in a small boat with sort of 8, 9 other men, depending on which time in the journey we're talking about. And he writes about himself as the leader. And who knows whether the rest of the crew thought of it that way. He tells us that's the way they thought of him. He felt responsible for the others. He's the most senior member in terms of the hierarchy of the company on board this small vessel. It's really tiny. A vessel's probably the wrong word, boat. And how he is talking about how he thinks the men are despairing, how he himself talks about experiences that are effectively sinful, but he can always bring it back to the positive message by, even though acknowledging some of these kind of negative emotions and sinful emotions as they are, but that faith in God will bring them back to the right path, and that this is the resolution of those moments of despair. So there's a very strong message through this text about, yes, some terrible kind of emotional experience happened, but we can restore ourselves back to a core shared understanding through faith practices. And it's a very interesting text because it's one of the few examples that I've seen where somebody is consciously talking about having to model behavior, having to model feelings that he says he didn't feel, but he felt that he had to model a particular kind of effective behavior. And to something, well, he never says he doesn't feel this religious behavior. He talks about the emotions in that way because he's their superior, and he sees himself responsible in that context. I will stop talking and again pass back to Linda.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. So as I said, I have just recently started my MSCA, and therefore for this presentation, I wanted to have a look at some preliminary findings that I collected before starting. So today I will be speaking about emotional paths to Catholic evangelization in 16th century Japan. And I will look at the case of consolation. As I mentioned, I will take an emotional practice approach, which is based on this text that you can see here by Monique Shear. According to this approach, basically the key step in the study of emotions become to identify these practices that surround them and come to make them basically. So I will look for the sayings and doings, as Monique Shear says, that come to compose emotion. Some of these practices can be subdivided in different groups, and today I will be mostly looking at mobilizing practices that aid us in achieving a certain emotional state, and at regulating practices, which are those that impart the desired emotional response by imparting the requisite bodily disposition. Together with this, in Jesuit sources, you generally also find communicating practices, which will be referred through the presentation. If we can move to the next slide, please, Sue. The first question to ask when approaching consolation in Jesuit texts is to try and identify what exactly is consolation. Classical literature has a long tradition of consolation as a theme, if not actually a genre. But when we look at Jesuit texts, I have to say that I think they follow very closely the definition that Ignatius Loyola gives of it in his spiritual exercises. The spiritual exercises were founding text of the Society of Jesus, one of the most important, and the one that certainly has most importance in the practices of the society. Ignatius compiled it far before then. He founded the society in 1540, and therefore they are influenced by a lot of late medieval and early modern traditions of Catholic spirituality. In this text, consolation is a key aspect to understand the will of God for one's person's life. Therefore, Loyola says that consolation is when an interior movement is aroused in the soul, by which it is inflamed with love of its creator and Lord, and as a consequence can love no creature on the face of the earth for its own sake, but only in the creator of them all. I call consolation every increase of faith, hope, and love, and all interior joy that invites and attracts to what is heavenly and to the salvation of one's soul by filling it with peace and quiet in its creator and Lord. Therefore, I will start from this very handy definition given by the founder of the Society of Jesus. Regarding sources, the sources I use for this case study are mostly letters. The Society of Jesus kept quite strict correspondence with all its centers in Europe and outside Europe, so mostly South America, North America, and Asia in the early modern period. Therefore, Jesuit letters are available in great quantities, and they were not just manuscript sources, but they were also often printed to be read by the European public. Therefore, we have a great amount of these letters, and some of the texts that were produced by the Japanese mission in this case, and one of the most interesting for us will be the Histoire du Japon by Louis Froys. So it's the history of the mission in Japan. Why am I looking at consolation or at emotions in general? As you hopefully will see with this case study, I come to believe that emotions in intercultural settings such as this one became a type of very important non-verbal communication that allowed the passage of the Christian message to the Japanese people, together with obviously the verbal communication that has received much attention in historiography, in the historiography of this mission. So from a certain point of view, I'm interested in emotions, mostly because they are a type of non-verbal, emotion practices, because they are a type of non-verbal communication. If we can go on, please. Thank you. Where does appear consolation in the sources? Consolation appears very, very often, I have to say, which is probably why my attention was caught by it. The Jesuits, not just the missionaries, but all Jesuits understood their mission as a work of consolation. And with this, they mean that everything that they did was supposed to bring consolation to other people, but also to themselves. It appears very often that the Jesuits mentions that they were consoled themselves, and this helped them sustain their work in often isolated situations, such as exactly these Asian missions. For example, we have here Luis de Almeida in 1562 that centers the most important activity of the missionaries in Japan as exactly consolation. We don't really have time to see this quotation, but yeah, consolation was recognized as one of the most important objectives of the missionaries. Correspondence too allowed a sort of circulation of consolation, and the letters were generally always mentioned as a source of consolation for the missionaries who received them. Could we please go on with the next slide? However, in this case study, we look at festival activities because it is one case in which consolation appears also among the converted people of the mission, so among the Japanese. This is a standard example of how consolation appears in the sources. So we have a description of this festival activity. We walked to the cross with much cheerfulness, singing the doctrine out loud in harmony, which caused much devotion. Arriving at the cross, which is very beautiful, we prayed, and then singing the same doctrine of the children, we went to the church, which was full of Christians. And so they heard a devout sermon about the words that the Lord said to his disciples. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, which is taken from John 13:35, and ends with, if you love one another. So again, the focus is on the emotional aspect of being a Christian, by which all were very consoled. So we see immediately that consolation comes with a lot of different activities, so a lot of different doings and a lot of different sayings. Therefore, we see activities such as praying, but also walking, singing. Yeah, if we could see the next slide, please. Consolation appears also as distributed, which means it is connected to objects and people. In particular, we see the mention of this beautiful cross. Crosses were constructions that were quite typical for Christian communities. It was generally the first sign that the community had converted to Christianity, even before they actually built a church. But we see that consolation is also connected to the presence of both children and adults. Therefore, there are a set of sensual stimuli that we see that are used by the Jesuit to actually evoke these emotion of consolation, some visual, auditory, kinesthetic. And also we see that there is a work on the conceptual level, that is the consolation is made explicit thanks exactly to a type of verbal communication such as the sermon. If we could go on with the next slide. I think there is now a question that must be asked, that is, whose consolation are we actually talking about? Unfortunately, these sources that are produced by the Jesuits are mostly European sources. These letters were written by European missionaries, which might be said could have projected their feelings on a community that was not actually feeling this consolation. So one question that comes that is very important at this point, I think, is to ask if these practices of consolation were actually recognized as such by the Japanese. In very few cases, we have a verbal confirmation that is mentioned in the sources, but unfortunately, we do not know exactly how they were recognized. No direct quotation is provided in the sources, and consolation as such is not explicitly mentioned by any Japanese. One thing that must be considered, however, is that for sure the Japanese practices were very convincing for the Jesuits, to the point that the Jesuits certainly believed that they were a part of the same emotional community. Therefore, emotions emerge, emotions as practices emerge, as I was saying, as an important part of nonverbal communication, which objective is obviously to communicate the Christian message. They were a key tool for evangelization in the sense that they helped building the emotional community that the Jesuits themselves recognized as part of the wider Catholic community, and supported the verbal message that the Europeans brought to Japan. They were then performed by the Japanese in a very convincing way, according to the Europeans, and in this way they could be read in a certain way on the bodies of the Japanese converts that were then recognized as part of these emotional communities. From this point of view, the consolation as practice can be considered part of the struggles of translation of the Christian message from one context, the European context, to the Japanese context. And we know that the Japanese mission met many of these similar problems on a verbal level, and therefore we can sort of insert these similar struggles for nonverbal communication in the same context. One example of these performance that could be read on the Japanese bodies was certainly weeping. If we could move to the next slide, we don't really have time to speak about weeping, so if we can skip this slide, please, Sue. Thank you. And so, as I was saying, we don't really have time to speak very much about weeping. But certainly it was read as a sign that consolation was working, that is, that God was acting on the hearts and on the souls of the converts. The fact that weeping was so prominent among the Japanese as an emotional performance, as an emotional practice, was possibly because it had been recognized by the Jesuits as present in the Buddhist context, and therefore had been recognized as a sort of a bridge that could be built between the practices of Buddhism and the practices of Christianity, and could therefore, in a certain way, be borrowed. Now, to quickly conclude, why did the Jesuits come to such a focus on consolation? We have seen that it was extremely important in the writings of Ignatius Loyola. Or maybe exactly for this reason, consolation was a sign of a successful mission, in the sense that it was a sign that could be read on bodies such as tears, that God was operating inside the community, was operating on the single convert, but also communally. And therefore, this presence of consolation on one side reassured the missionaries themselves, but on the other side also reassured the Jesuits, their superiors that were in Europe, that the mission was being successful. And they also reassured the readership that Jesuit letters had in Europe. Therefore, from a certain point of view, to mobilize consolation was to mobilize faith. Because to be consoled, and we come back to Loyola's definition, was to accept God's presence in one's life and thus become part of the emotional global Catholic community, which in the end was the objective of the Jesuit mission in Japan. Thank you very much.
I'll stop sharing the PowerPoint, but I just noticed I'm going to slip in a very quick note to say that when I was talking about the Centre for the History of Emotions, I should note that we currently have virtual fellowships being advertised that people can apply for to come and work with the centre. There are 9 universities around Australia that you can work with, and you can work across them. These are virtual fellowships given the circumstances we're in at the moment. So if anyone is interested, they are still open till the end of this month.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Linda, for that really rich and wide-ranging series of examples you gave us, which really highlight the closely interwoven nature of the pragmatic and professional expectations of these travelling men and their sense of mission, their moral sense of purpose, even while they're registering their emotional reactions to events that are unexpected, or even in the case of the festival, not unexpected, but surprisingly touching to them. And while they're doing this, they really reinforce a common framework for understanding with their superiors or with people who are not in the place that they're describing. So there's this kind of anthropology and sociology to the work that they're doing, that in the disciplinary terms that we might be thinking of today. Thank you so much. And Linda as well, thank you. I was just really interested to follow up a little bit from your conclusion, because you remind us really well in the written version of your paper that edification etymologically has this sense of community building, and so that sense that the way the individual person is edified by participation in a mass event is an emotional aspect of lived religion. And I wondered if you wanted to say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, edification is edification is a very important aspect that returns very often in Jesuit sources. And I do believe that edification has a key emotional element. However, it comes with the similar problems of consolation. That is, there is no really specific definition that can be applied. Unfortunately, in the case of edification, Loyola did not write anything, nor really other Jesuits bothered to mention exactly what it is that they meant with it. Therefore, you sort of have to proceed by I think, try to understand what context edification appears. And I have to say it always appears together with consolation. At a certain point, I even had the doubt that they might be synonymous in certain understandings of certain Jesuit understandings. Again, I think because Jesuits saw consolation as so important in the community that it makes sense that it is one of the key parts of edification. And yes, as you were saying, edification comes from the word itself, comes from the idea of building a church in a sense of community. And therefore, if edification is one of the objectives, then consolation becomes one of the evidence, a type of evidence that this process is working. And it might even be simply the emotional aspect of edification itself. But I have to say, I'm still looking into these topics. So again, I only have these preliminary findings, not even findings really.
Yeah.
So sorry.
No, really fascinating, really I'm looking forward to hearing more of your work later. So just now we have plenty of time for questions from everybody in the audience, and feel free to switch your video back on if you like, and you can put your question in the chat or raise your hand and I'll come to you. Meta's got a question. She says her connection's unstable, so I'll read the question out, and it's for Linda. What a great project. I realize you're in the very early stages, but could you perhaps give an example of how the Japanese are described in your sources in terms of emotional otherness, perhaps?
Yes, excuse me. Thank you for this question. Yes, what happens with the Japanese is a bit particular, because the Japanese mission is such a big enterprise in comparison with other Asian missions, that it really depends at what period you're looking at and what exactly which mission inside Japan you're also looking at. So there are many different aspects. However, if I can just move a little bit the focus of the question, for example, the Chinese mission does not have this problem, in that it was much limited in scope, and therefore there is one single image from an emotional point of view that that appears out of Jesuit writings. Therefore, if you look at the writings of the Chinese mission, it emerges immediately that the most important emotional dimension that the Chinese people were connected to was fear. Fear was the basic emotion that was connected to the Chinese, with fear of the foreigner, fear of their superiors, fear of the system in which they moved. And this, then, I think the important part of identifying this emotion as connected with Chinese people is that then it goes on to have an impact on the evangelizing strategies of the missionaries, that feel they have necessary to start from this idea that the Chinese people are fearful. When it comes instead to Japanese people, as I said, there are many different emotions that are connected to their national type, if you want to call it like that, that was attributed to them by the missionaries. For example, they were considered to be fearless in war. These also had great consequences on the approach that the missionaries had, because it became clear quite soon for nearly everybody that Japan could not be conquered with force, basically, because the Japanese were such fearless people that it would be basically be impossible to conquer the country, and therefore this meant that the Jesuit practices had to accommodate to Japan to actually be able to convert, to enter the country. That it could not be converted by force. And another type of emotion that is connected to the Japanese is consolation, exactly as I have presented today, which is not a characteristic, not considered characteristic of the Chinese mission, again, because the Chinese were considered to be cold towards religion, and therefore it was difficult for them to feel consolation at the level of the Japanese. And I hope this answers a little bit this question.
Thank you, Linda. I would just like to ask Sue a question which looks in the other direction, sort of away from the humans and up to the divine, because in the written version of your paper, you really emphasize this point that the documents, I think especially, I can't quite remember, is it Van der Graaf's journal, framed by the presence of God, and thinking as well of what you were saying in your presentation about the heteronormative assumptions and the kind of constructions of masculinity that are going on in the documents, what kind of God do they imagine? You know, what kind of God is depicted in the journals, in the, you know, more broadly?
That's a wonderful question, and I think the answer is a varied one depending on some of the context. They both these accounts are referencing God throughout, because Lehman is talking very much about his individual relation with another kind of superior that he's modeling, not that he's modeling himself on God, but he's in a relationship with him that helps him work out how to be a leader of these people. That's a very different setup to perhaps in the very particular writing around that event, where the two young men are sent off, and they frame it in terms of divine punishment. It's a motif that doesn't really come in. Well, okay, it does come in the prayer that we pray that God will be sympathetic to us, but they don't generally say that they think he's punishing them for something. So it's kind of perhaps less explicit than it comes forward in that particular moment, where I think they're under real pressure to justify how they just put these two men effectively kind of to death. And then suddenly this language of divine punishment is very strong rhetorically. But on the other hand, of course, this is not a massive surprise in the culture of the time that they would find this a very difficult act. And of course, in European society more broadly, that does not surprise us. But in the context of seafaring company, where you have men in close quarters, there's a particular sensibility, a particular concern about people basically forming emotional bonds of another kind. Okay, so this is both moral, problem, but it's also an emotional problem there too, that men will form other kinds of hierarchies amongst themselves, and they will disrespect the hierarchy of the company. So that's problematic too at an emotional level. That's not framed in that way. I mean, that's me saying that. It's implied rather than in the presence of the text, but certainly clear throughout that documentation, the deep concern about any kinds of discovery of non-normative sexual behavior between men is a problem. That's difficult to answer your question. I feel like it comes up in that moment more than anywhere else in the text, but I would have to have a think through.
Thank you very much. We still have time for more questions, so please share all your comments as well.
If I can jump in while people are thinking, if people are just thinking for the moment, to pick up on the question that Linda answered a minute ago, one of the things that I'm working on in another project is about Jesuits in Japan who are trying to convert Koreans who end up in Japan, generally involuntarily as a consequence of the Japanese invasions of Joseon, Korea at the end of the 16th century. So the Jesuits are meeting this population of people who are usually captured, sometimes enslaved, very rarely voluntarily in Japan. And the Jesuits talk about them as being particularly susceptible as a population to conversion, and that Koreans make wonderful converts and that they're very zealous, and they're not at all like the Japanese, because the Japanese are the warriors who have just, well, they didn't win in those invasions, in fact, but there's a sense that when you're dealing with these Koreans who have come back to Japan, you're dealing with a kind of captive and submissive population who have particular characteristics because they're effectively stuck in Japan, can't come home. They're susceptible to the Catholic message. And so it's a very different tendency to think about them emotionally to the local population when they meet them in Japan. So it's very interesting the way these kind of national stereotypes of operate through emotion lenses as well.
Thanks, Sue. Natasha has put a comment in the chat, I think referring to your earlier remarks about, is there some connection to the idea that having women on board is bad luck and the potential of emotional disruption rising? And I'd be interested to know how widespread, in fact, that is, because I've just been reading Persuasion, Jane Austen's novel Persuasion, to teach to undergraduates. And that's one of the themes of that book too, is where's the right place for women compared to naval men? It
is a problem for the company. Women are on the vessels quite often, not necessarily accompanying, certainly not really accompanying partners in the way that perhaps persuasion sets up, I think, in that dynamic. But they're part of the people being moved from place to place. And in fact, in the early days of the Dutch East India Company, we have the Governor General in Batavia saying, please send out more single women because we need partners, appropriate partners, let's say, for the company officials and crew out here. And so that's part of their strategy, is to govern a certain kind of set of relationships using women. And that becomes difficult after the Batavia massacre. So this is actually one of the events where in the Batavia massacre on board are traveling a number of women with families and so forth. And those women's families are killed, and the women are used as effectively kind of sexual slaves on the island. And then we have some of those women survive. Judith Bastien is a very famous example. And then we have the company officials fascinatingly going through their documentation, working out in economic terms what her virginity is worth and how much compensation they're going to give her. And the company has great difficulty, as you can imagine, in working this out. And afterwards says, we cannot have women on board like this. We don't want to be having debates about, this is not our business to be working out what virginity is worth. It's a fascinating set of deliberations they're having. So clearly the women on board is a difficult presence, but they never in any way remove women, and slaves are a good example. Women are always on board in some form in the company. So they don't have it in the same sense as persuasion, but it's deeply problematic, but they don't ever resolve it as a complete ban. That would be also difficult for other parts of their policy.
It's interesting too that one of their rhetorical strategies for resolving it is to kind of blanket it in bureaucratic language and practice and kind of push the emotional and relational aspects to the side. Alex Walsham, can we come to you for your question, please?
Oh, thank you very much. So I was wondering whether, Sue, in your work, you're also considering the extent to which God himself has emotions, and how his his status, perhaps not as the recipient or the sufferer of disaster, but as the inflictor of discipline and disaster, and how far there's a conceptualization in the texts that you're looking at of divine emotional states, and in a way divine masculinity, and how that is played out in these extreme circumstances that they're considering.
Yes, I think that is there. It's certainly there in the kind of sodomy event, that they're concerned about God being angry with them and then inflicting punishment on them. But it certainly comes earlier when the events first happen, is like, what did we do? Will God be merciful and answer our prayer or not? I think that's, sorry, there's a helicopter going over at the same time. I hope you can't hear that. I think that is certainly an undercurrent, but it's an undercurrent to the whole company. Does God approve of what it is we're doing? When things go right, this is a sign that God is really happy and he wants us to go out and do this trading work and to some extent missionary work around the world. And this is why moments of disaster are so important for the company to make sense of and to rationalize that this isn't God saying you're doing the wrong thing. And this, of course, operating at a time when there are other models for how Europeans are going out in the world. Jesuits are one, eventually East India Company in the later time, the later era of the Dutch East India Company. There are competitions for this model. Danish East India Company, quite a number of them. So to try and make sense that they are the right ones, and success is a sign that God thought what you were doing was right generally. So these moments where things go wrong, I think are always really interesting for trying to reconceptualize how we make sense that this isn't God telling us that we've done it wrong, and trying to put it in some other mode. So yes, I think God does have emotions that they're trying to understand. To answer your question very simply.
Thank you both. I couldn't see who was first between Anne and Catherine.
No, please, Kat, go ahead. And if there's no time, I can ask my question later on separately.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, both of you for really thought-provoking work. Chimes with a lot of, in a very different context of the things that I'm thinking about it, you know, the kind of this, the role of rituals and kind of the bodily inscribing of emotional reactions. So I was really struck by this example that you do have, which is so rare, as you said, of this kind of cognizance of maybe a disconnect between the feeling, or the kind of expected feeling, this kind of you know, kind of an emotional reaction should come out of something that you're doing. I'm just wondering if you do. Are there any other ways in which you've looked at that kind of when the emotional performance breaks down, or what happens with the dissonance of kind of the emotional community breaks down? Or are there any other ways that we can think about? Because it's something I'm really interested in as well, about how that helps us think about kind of change as well. You know, when perhaps rituals or performances are changing because there's a sense that they can't contain, or they can't kind of manage the situation, especially in those moments of crisis or disaster. I mean, that's a pretty, you know, to find that example is quite rare, but I feel it was a really interesting thing to think about.
So obviously the company archive is massive, and I haven't read all of it by any means, but I think it is unusual. And I'll give you another example of why I think that's the case. But so with Lehman, for example, I think it's I find it really interesting and quite rare that he's sitting there saying, I felt despair, and so did my men. But not even just what I would have expected, which is my men felt despair, and I was able to bring them back. But he actually says, I felt it myself. And I think the only way that can work in this text that ends up in the company archive, it's going to his superiors, is because he resolves it. He resolves it. And if it weren't resolved, it wouldn't be in there. That would be my short answer. So everything we've got in this company archive is the positive end story. And that's where that end story matters. You know, who knows what actually happened? Who knows what any of them felt? So you can only bring these things in if you can show you can resolve it. To give you kind of a slightly different example, but again, working with some Korean material, where I'm working on Dutch East India Company, again, another kind of a storm, the ship goes off course, they end up in Korea, and Korea at this time is a hermit kingdom, you can't leave. So they end up spending 13 years in Korea. And at the end of it, they do manage to escape. They go to Japan, they write an account of what happened. And in that account, they're absolutely silent about any relationships with women. And you go, really? 13 years? You never really, you know? But anyway, but this is an account that's written as they rejoin the company. And they're talking about the whole time, all I wanted to do was come back to the company, and, you know, and I tried to escape all the time. And then a couple of years later, some other members of the crew, so there's about 7 of them who come back to Europe, and they all start talking to various people, and we find other accounts where they mention, where it is mentioned in one sentence that they left wives and children behind in Korea. So I know this is not exactly the same kind of example, but it's an example where, like, it's not appropriate to mention that in the account. One, you've abandoned them, that would be terrible, but 2, you had them. That meant at some level you started to join that society, and you no longer thought of yourself as a company man, which is the story you're trying to tell as you're rejoining the company. And in fact, even more than that, the person writing the account is asking for 13 years wages because he is a company man and he should be paid for all that time. So that context is really important. And yet we can see, again, it's another kind of rare example where we suddenly get another story told elsewhere in one sentence that suggests something else was actually happening as well. So I do think the context of being part of the archive, making it into the archive, making it into the level that it stays in the archive. I mean, maybe other people wrote these accounts and they never got sent all the way through to the Heren in Amsterdam for me to find, you know. So there's various points where, one, did people write this stuff up? If they wrote it up, did it make it past Batavia? Did it make it past Batavia to get to Cape? Did it get to the Cape? Did it get to the Netherlands? So there's a lot of places where you can, you know, take out stories that don't fit, so that by the time you get to the kind of pure archive, and it's not the only archive, but, and this is the good thing about the companies, you have various archives and you do get sort of points of difference, you start to triangulate stories. But, you know, the archive in the Netherlands is a pretty polished business at some level. It's not perfect, but, you know, you have to think that the stories only get there because they're telling the right story most of the time, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both. Hannah, would you like to squeeze in your question just before we close, as we started a moment late? I think we can run one more.
I think it was sort of, already answered by Sue. I was really interested in the prescribing element and the audience of these texts, like who were they trying to convince, and what are those kinds of elements that are especially striking in them. in that sense. I guess it was a continuation.
I think this will probably apply for Linda as well, but you might want to jump in here, Linda. I think in most of these cases, they're writing to their superiors. So in the Jesuit mission, they're writing, well, I mean, you can talk more about this, of course, too, Linda. They're writing back home. They're trying to generate money in some cases trying to prove that this mission is working. In the Dutch East India model, it's not quite that same link, but they're still trying to prove that their mission, which is a different kind of mission, is working and it's right. And in both cases, I would guess it's kind of superior authorities. Linda, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, in my case too, basically, also from the emotional level, they absolutely had to present a community with which they could work, because they could be recalled, moved at any time. And so therefore, on one side, they had to present, in this case, community that was open to consolation or to other type of religious emotions to the superiors. But also at the same time, they knew that some letters would be published. Therefore, they need to be careful with what they wrote. In relation to the European readership that could then become patrons of the mission if they believed that the activity that the mission was doing could also console themselves. So there is a sort of movement of consolation towards in these texts. That certainly had an influence on the texts themselves.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Linda and Sue, for giving us these really rich examples that are very unfamiliar to me. So really, a whole new institutional landscape as well as a geographical landscape for us to consider, and also showing us how the history of emotions methodologies can work in practice. It's been really constructive, and thank you everyone for joining us. We will now have a 10-minute break and then return for the early career poster session. Thank you.